She was just walking through the forest when she suddenly saw a desert in the middle of the pine trees. There was a house standing in the sand, and inside lived an old man who refused to give up. He guarded the land that everyone had forgotten. But when the woman realized why the corporation wanted to take this piece of land, it was already too late. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road to the northern forests wound like an old ribbon, cracked and quiet, surrounded by the kind of stillness that made even the hum of the engine sound intrusive. Evelyn Morris had driven for nearly 6 hours when the last traces of the highway disappeared behind her. What stretched ahead was solitude, a landscape of pine and mist, of empty cabins and forgotten signs eaten by rust. She rolled down the window, breathing in the sharp scent of resin and cold air, and felt, for the first time in months, something like relief. There was no traffic here, no deadlines, no reminders of a marriage that had become little more than an arrangement between two people who'd run out of reasons to talk. Her small rental cabin stood at the edge of a lake, its reflection fractured by ripples of wind. Inside, the air smelled of pine wood and dust, untouched for a long time. She unpacked slowly, placing her notebooks on the small table by the window. For years, Evelyn had built gardens and landscapes meant to look alive, projects designed for corporate spaces, hotels, exhibition halls. She had learned to make nature obedient, trees trimmed into perfection, grass chosen not for its scent, but for its photogenic quality. Somewhere along the way, she had lost what had first drawn her to her profession, the raw, imperfect harmony of the natural world. In the following days, she explored the forest trails that spread from her cabin like veins. The forest was ancient, filled with the hum of insects and the echo of woodpeckers. It reminded her of her mother, who used to bring her to this region when she was a child. Her mother had taught her the names of trees, not from books, but from touch, the rough bark of spruce, the needle softness of fir, the sweet resin of pine that lingered on fingers long after you touched it. Evelyn had not thought of those summers in years, and the memory made her pause on the trail one morning, looking up at the sunlight, breaking through the canopy in gold and green fragments. She wondered, fleetingly, if the forest remembered her too. It was on the third day that she saw it, the anomaly that didn't belong. She had climbed a narrow path that rose above the tree line, just high enough to see the landscape spread out below her. At first, it was the shape that caught her attention, too regular to be natural, a square, perfectly framed by the chaos of forest. Inside that square, the color was wrong pale, dry, sunlit even under clouds. She blinked, thinking it was a trick of light, but when she stepped closer, she saw what it truly was: a desert, a wound of sand in the middle of an evergreen sea. Curiosity overtook hesitation. She followed a dirt path that seemed to lead in that direction, the air growing warmer the closer she came. The forest floor changed under her boots, from moss to hard earth, then to fine grains that crunched dryly. She felt as if she were crossing into another climate, another season entirely. And there, at the center of it all, stood a house. It was a 2-story structure built of gray stone, its roof half collapsed on one side, withered ivy clinging to the walls like memory that refused to die. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing. Around it lay remnants of metal pipes, half-buried concrete rings, and wooden stakes long since broken. It didn't look abandoned, though. The air carried the faint, unmistakable scent of smoke, the kind that came from a hearth, not a wildfire. When she approached, the front door opened with a slow creak, and an old man stepped into the frame. He was tall, his back slightly bent, but not fragile. His clothes were simple, worn, heavy flannel shirt, dark trousers, boots dulled by dust. His eyes, gray like the stone of the house, studied her without hostility, but without welcome either. "You're lost," he said, not as a question. "I don't think so," Evelyn replied. "I was walking through the forest. I saw this." She gestured around them. "It doesn't look natural." He smiled faintly, a dry curve of the mouth. "No, it doesn't. It used to be forest once, before men with drills came." There was something about his voice, a steadiness that carried fatigue rather than bitterness. He introduced himself as Thomas Hale. He lived there alone, had done so for decades. When she asked how he managed, he shrugged. "There's a well. I trade with the town sometimes. It's enough." Evelyn glanced at the ground. The sand shimmered faintly in the sunlight, almost metallic. She crouched and let it run through her fingers. It was fine, unnaturally uniform, as though filtered. Beneath it, she could feel something harder, compacted. "This doesn't happen on its own," she murmured. "No," Thomas said quietly. "We made it happen. Years ago. We thought we were searching for clean energy, minerals, something useful. We found nothing but this." He motioned toward the wasteland stretching around the house. They packed up and left. I didn't. Evelyn followed him inside. The house was dim but orderly, filled with relics of another time maps pinned to the walls, stacks of yellowed notebooks, glass jars containing samples of soil and sand. On the desk by the window sat an old geologist's hammer, its handle worn smooth. "You worked here?" she asked. "I did. When it was still a research site. When the company shut everything down, I stayed. Thought I could fix what we ruined. I tried planting, watering. Nothing grows. Whatever's beneath the surface. Metal, oil, toxins. It keeps the roots from breathing." His words hung heavy in the air. Evelyn walked to the window, looking out at the emptiness beyond. "Have you ever tested it?" she asked. He gave a short laugh. "Once. Years ago. Sent samples to a university. They never replied. Probably thought it was just another crackpot's complaint." When she left, the sun was already low, and the sand reflected it like a mirror. On the path back to the forest, she kept thinking about the man, the land, the futility that seemed to cling to both. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this place than an old geologist's regret. That night, in the cabin, she couldn't sleep. The image of that square of desert kept returning, its edges too perfect, its silence too complete. She pulled out the small container of soil she had gathered in her pocket and set it under the lamplight. The grains glinted faintly, not like sand, but like crushed glass. The next morning, she drove to the nearby town. It was small one main street, a diner, a post office, a municipal building with peeling paint. She asked the woman at the diner about the old house in the forest. The woman frowned. "Oh, you mean Hale's land? That man's been there forever. Used to work for the mining company back when they were doing tests out there. Whole project went bad. Something about contamination. Folks around here don't talk about it much." "What kind of contamination?" Evelyn asked. The woman shrugged. "Something in the soil," they said. "The trees started dying, animals left. Government came, shut it down. After that, Hale wouldn't leave. Guess he thought he could fix it. Poor man's been chasing ghosts ever since." Evelyn thanked her and left, but the conversation only deepened her curiosity. She drove to the county's environmental office. The clerk, a young man in a green uniform, looked confused when she asked for historical land records. "You're not from Arcos, are you?" he asked cautiously. "Arcos?" "Yeah, the development group. They just got approval to start restoration work on the old industrial zone out there. You might have seen the ad returning life to the pines. Big PR thing." Her pulse quickened. "Do you know which site?" He typed into his computer, then turned the screen slightly toward her. The aerial map showed a square of light-colored soil in the middle of dark forest. She didn't need to look twice. "That's the one." She left the office with a folder of copies and a growing sense of unease. Arcos Development was one of those corporations that branded itself as green, known for buying damaged lands and turning them into eco-resorts or sustainable communities. The kind of projects she herself had designed landscapes for, projects that were meant to heal the planet, but in truth only masked the scars. Back in her cabin, she opened the files. The soil reports were outdated, vague, the contamination levels listed as within tolerable limits. Yet the photographs showed nothing tolerable, just the same desolation she had seen with her own eyes. The papers were signed only by Arcos representatives, not by independent experts. She sat at the table for a long time, listening to the rain begin to fall outside, tapping lightly against the window. Something in her stirred a mix of anger and recognition. This was the same pattern she'd seen 100 times in the city. Corporate projects dressed in the language of healing while quietly destroying what was left to protect. Only this time, it wasn't a park or a plaza. It was a living landscape, silenced under a layer of engineered sand. The next morning, she returned to the forest. The rain had turned the paths slick, the air thick with mist. When she reached the boundary where the trees ended and the sand began, she stopped. The contrast was even starker now, the dark, wet soil giving way to pale dryness, water refusing to cross the invisible border. Thomas was outside, tending a small fire in a metal drum. He looked up as she approached, then gestured for her to sit. "You came back," he said simply. "I read about Arcos," she replied. "They're planning to start something here." He nodded, poking the embers. "They came last month, promised to make this place green again, said it was their duty to right the past. Do you believe them? I believed men like them once." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Evelyn looked out at the wasteland, its color unchanged even after the rain. It was hard to imagine anything growing there. She thought of the slogan, returning life to the pines, and felt the bitter irony of it. When she finally stood to leave, Thomas said, "If they start again, the ground will die for good. You understand that?" She did, and as she walked back through the forest, the decision was already forming. She would find out what Arcos really wanted with this land, because if there was one thing she knew, it was that nothing in her profession or in theirs was ever done out of pure goodwill. And that was how it began. Not with an investigation or a mission, but with a woman who had once built fake gardens, deciding to protect one real piece of dying earth. The following week, the forest no longer felt the same. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now carried tension, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Evelyn drove the winding road that led toward Thomas's land, and from the distance she could already see it bright trucks parked at the edge of the sand, their white sides gleaming with the green logo of Arcos Development. The slogan painted across them read, in large, comforting letters, "Renewing nature, restoring balance." She parked by the old wooden fence that marked the beginning of Thomas's property and walked the last stretch on foot. The sound of engines and mechanical pumps echoed through the air, sharp against the natural hush of the forest. Men in uniforms were spreading a pale mixture over the ground, while others installed stakes and small surveillance cameras. It looked less like ecological work and more like preparation for construction. Thomas stood near the porch, his expression unchanged, but his jaw tight. When he saw her, he gave a small nod of acknowledgement, though his eyes never left the workers. "They came 2 days ago," he said when she reached him. "Didn't ask, just started." Evelyn looked around. "Do they have permission?" They have a paper, he said quietly. A paper always comes first. She followed his gaze toward a man who seemed to be in charge, a project manager in a crisp jacket and boots, too clean for the terrain. He was directing the workers with an air of practiced confidence, stopping occasionally to talk into a headset. Evelyn watched as he knelt to inspect the mixture being poured across the ground. It was thick, chalk-colored, and had an artificial sheen. Something about the smell chemical and faintly metallic made her stomach tighten. They call it soil binding, Thomas said, almost reading her thoughts. It's what they used in the 70s, when they were trying to stabilize the drilling area. It seals the surface so the machines don't sink. They said it was safe then, too. Evelyn crouched, letting a bit of the mixture fall through her fingers. It was cold and heavy, not the texture of anything that would nurture life. They're not restoring, she murmured. They're hardening the ground. Of course they are, Thomas replied. They need a foundation. The man in charge noticed them and approached with the kind of smile that professionals wear like armor. Good morning, he said cheerfully. I'm glad to see local interest. Mr. Hale, right? And you must be Ms. Morris, the landscape designer? Evelyn froze. How do you know my name? The man's smile didn't falter. Oh, it's a small world. We read about your projects in Portland. Beautiful work. We could use expertise like yours in our green initiatives. His words dripped with polished civility, but there was an unmistakable edge behind them, a corporate friendliness that carried warning beneath the sugar. You should know, he continued, that this site has been selected for rehabilitation under federal environmental codes. Everything we're doing is entirely compliant. You'll see results soon enough. Results, Thomas said flatly, don't always mean repair. The man's eyes flickered, but he recovered quickly. Progress, Mr. Hale. That's what we mean. Then, with a final nod, he turned away. Evelyn stayed for hours, taking photographs while pretending to be simply curious. She noticed how every movement of the workers was meant for display. A drone hovered above, recording footage for Arcos's inevitable promotional video. They planted rows of drought-resistant grass, then watered it with a chemical spray that smelled faintly of solvent. By evening, they packed their equipment and left the site pristine, a stage set for the illusion of environmental rebirth. When the last truck disappeared, Thomas extinguished his cigarette and said, "Give it 3 days. You'll see what kind of life they bring." He was right. On the 4th day, when Evelyn returned, the grass had turned a sickly gray. The soil had hardened into a crust that cracked under her boots. The air smelled faintly of metal and ozone. The cameras were still there, their lenses quietly watching, transmitting whatever image Arcos wanted the world to see. She sat on the porch steps beside Thomas. "It's not even subtle," she said bitterly. "They're pretending to restore while they prepare for construction. That's the only kind of restoration they know," he replied. Over the next week, Evelyn's determination hardened into purpose. She began collecting samples, small containers of soil, pieces of the artificial compound, dead grass blades. Late at night, in her cabin, she examined them under a magnifying glass, making notes in her field journal. Every test she improvised confirmed what she already suspected. The chemical content was entirely incompatible with plant life. She decided to take her findings to the local environmental office again. The young clerk who had helped her before looked nervous when she entered. "Ms. Morris," he said, glancing around, "I think it's best you don't get involved in this." "Why not?" "Because Arcos isn't just a company here. They've partnered with the county. There's funding, publicity, jobs. Nobody wants trouble. It's called a revitalization initiative, and the paperwork is already signed." She leaned across the counter, her voice low. "You've seen the reports. You know the soil isn't recoverable. They're sealing contamination, not cleaning it." He hesitated, then sighed. I know, but people in charge don't care about the difference. Evelyn left, anger pressing against her chest like heat. She drove straight to the local library and spent the afternoon combing through archived records. Most documents were redacted, their pages stamped Proprietary Data Arcos Research Division. Yet buried among them, she found copies of geological surveys from 1979, handwritten notes describing a containment breach during the final drilling phase. The data mentioned cadmium, mercury, and other heavy metals at concentrations that should have rendered the entire area permanently unsafe. When she showed Thomas the papers that evening, his hands trembled slightly as he held them. I remember that week, he said. They told us it was minor, just a surface leak. But after that, the trees started dying. And the water in the well turned strange, had a taste you couldn't describe. That's when most of the team left. I didn't. Fool that I was. Evelyn looked at him, realizing that the man had spent his life guarding a graveyard of his own profession's making. You weren't a fool, she said softly. You were the only one who stayed. He smiled faintly. Staying doesn't mean winning. In the following days, Arcos intensified their presence. Trucks came daily, unloading more material. Banners were erected at the perimeter. Community Green Zone Future Site of Eco Lodge and Conservation Center. Evelyn's anger now had focus. She began to document everything systematically. Photographs, soil samples, time-stamped observations. She stored them in a folder she labeled Arcos, Actual Conditions. One evening, after a particularly long day of photographing the site, she found a letter slipped under the door of her cabin. The envelope was unmarked. Inside, a printed note. Cease unauthorized activity on Arcos project grounds. Future trespassing will result in legal action. No signature? No logo? She sat for a long while at the table, the note trembling slightly in her hand. Fear tried to rise, but she pushed it down. She had been intimidated by silence before, by men in boardrooms who wanted her to design beauty for profit, but she had never been afraid of truth. When she told Thomas, he only shrugged. It means you're doing something right. That night, they searched his storage shed for more records. The smell of dust and oil filled the air. Between old boxes of tools, they found a wooden crate labeled Logs, 1978-1981. Inside were brittle pages covered in neat handwriting, Thomas's notes from the drilling years. There were coordinates, chemical measurements, and sketches of borehole structures. Among them was a page titled Test B14, Depth Anomaly. Evelyn traced the coordinates with her finger. That's near the western edge, isn't it? Thomas nodded slowly. Where the first leak happened. They went out the next morning to locate it. The site was half buried under layers of new sand, the ground smoother than the rest. Evelyn knelt and began scraping with a trowel until metal glinted beneath. A corroded rod emerged, still marked with the faded tag B14. It was proof, physical and undeniable, that the contamination zone remained untouched beneath the surface. This is it, she whispered. This is what they're hiding. They took photographs and samples, labeling everything carefully. That evening, Evelyn sent digital copies of her findings to a contact in Seattle, a colleague from her university days, who now worked in environmental forensics. She didn't expect an immediate reply, but within a day she received an email marked urgent. Her friend confirmed the soil was still chemically active. Disturbing it for construction would risk spreading toxins into groundwater. Arcos was not restoring anything. They were burying a hazard under a new layer of corporate branding. The next day, a sleek black SUV arrived at Thomas's property. The same project manager stepped out. his smile sharper this time. "Mr. Hale," he said smoothly, "we understand you've been hosting visitors who are not authorized to access our site." Thomas said nothing. Evelyn stood beside him. The man continued, "We appreciate your cooperation thus far, but interference could complicate things for everyone. I suggest you let us finish what we started. It's for the good of the community." "The good of the community," Thomas repeated, "doesn't start with a lie." The man's polite facade cracked for a moment, then reassembled. "Suit yourself," he said, returning to the car. After the SUV left, Evelyn turned to Thomas. "They're going to push harder now." He looked out over the sand, his expression unreadable. "Then we push back." Over the next nights, they prepared a full dossier. Evelyn organized every document, every test result, every photograph. Together, they wrote a report detailing the history of the site, from the original drilling to the false restoration project. They printed copies and sealed them in envelopes. One set would go to the local news outlet, another to the Environmental Commission. When they finished, the old man leaned back in his chair, exhausted but content. "You know," he said, "I stayed here because I thought I could make it right by myself. Turns out it takes someone new to see the same wound and call it what it is." Evelyn smiled faintly. "We'll make them listen." As dawn broke, light spilling through the cracked windows, the sand outside seemed to glow pale gold, deceptive in its stillness. Beneath it, poison slept. Above it, the illusion of progress had been built carefully and proudly. But now, finally, someone was watching. The world beyond the pines was about to learn that healing cannot be built on lies. The rain began before dawn, soft at first, then heavier, filling the air with the scent of wet pine and metal. Evelyn woke to the steady rhythm of it against her cabin roof, and for a moment lay still, listening. The storm had been predicted for days, but she hadn't expected it to come with such force. The world outside had turned gray and blurred, the trees swaying in the wind like a restless sea. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled a low, trembling sound that seemed to echo the unease that had taken root in her chest. She knew that this day would bring consequences. The report she and Thomas had finished had been sent out 2 days earlier to the Environmental Commission, to journalists, and to a few contacts she trusted in the city. She hadn't expected silence, but that was exactly what followed. No replies, no acknowledgement, no sign that anyone had even read it. And yet, she could feel the shift in the air, the tightening of invisible strings. Arcos would know. They would have received copies, one way or another. When she arrived at Thomas's house, the trucks were already gone. The sand stretched empty under the rain, its pale color darkened to a dull gray. The banners Arcos had raised had been torn down by the wind, the plastic tangled around broken posts. It was almost peaceful in its ruin, like a stage abandoned after the actors had fled. Thomas was sitting on the porch, his coat damp, a blanket over his knees. He looked up as she approached, his expression calm, even weary. "They pulled out last night," he said. "Took the cameras, the equipment, left before the storm." "Do you think it's over?" Evelyn asked. He shook his head slowly. "No. They don't give up. They wait for silence." She looked out at the expanse of land. The rain had softened the surface, forming small rivulets that ran toward the edges, but the water didn't sink in. It slid off as though the ground itself rejected it. "You were right," she murmured. "They didn't want to fix this place. They wanted to bury it." Thomas smiled faintly, though it was more sadness than satisfaction. People like to bury what reminds them of their mistakes. Later that morning, a black SUV appeared on the dirt road again. It stopped just short of the porch, its tires sinking slightly in the mud. 3 men stepped out, all in dark suits, the rain glistening on their shoulders. The same project manager from before led them. His expression was tight, stripped of the practiced charm he had worn on earlier visits. "Mr. Hale," he began, raising his voice over the rain, "we're here to inform you that the Arcos Rehabilitation Project has been temporarily suspended pending review. However, you are still in violation of several land use regulations. Your interference has caused considerable delays." Thomas leaned on his cane. "What you call interference, I call survival." The man's eyes flicked to Evelyn. "And you, Ms. Morris, you've been spreading misinformation to the press. You've taken photographs of private property, accessed restricted zones. That's a serious offense." Evelyn met his gaze. "Restricted zones don't exist on land you poisoned and abandoned 40 years ago." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think anyone cares? You think a few pictures will stop progress? We'll wait, Ms. Morris. People forget. They always do." She didn't move. Not this time. The silence that followed was thick, cut only by the hiss of rain. The man finally turned and walked back to the SUV. The door slammed shut, and the vehicle disappeared into the gray distance, leaving deep tracks in the wet sand. Thomas exhaled slowly. "They'll be back with lawyers next time." Evelyn nodded. "Then we'll be ready." That evening, she drove to the nearby town. The main street was quiet, except for a few flickering lights in the diner. Inside, a television was playing local news. At first, she didn't pay attention, until she heard the words, "Arcos Development," spoken by the anchor. She turned toward the screen. The report showed footage of the so-called rehabilitation project, cut together with careful narration. There were shots of workers planting trees, smiling families standing beside a banner that read, "Community Renewal Initiative." The voiceover spoke of progress and partnership. But then, for a brief moment, the image changed. A different photo appeared, one she recognized instantly. It was one of hers, a picture of the dead grass and cracked soil she had taken days before. The caption below read, "Whistleblower claims Arcos project unsafe." Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. Someone had listened after all. The reporter continued, mentioning that the state's Environmental Commission had launched an independent investigation into the site's safety protocols. The footage cut back to the anchor, who added that Arcos representatives had declined to comment. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a start. She ordered a coffee, sat by the window, and watched the rain turn the streets into rivers of light. When she returned to the forest, Thomas was asleep in his chair, a blanket pulled high over his chest. She set a newspaper beside him, the headline visible enough for him to see when he woke. State orders inquiry into Arcos. Site contamination. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. His breathing was shallow but peaceful. The next days passed in a blur of interviews and visits. Journalists arrived, some curious, others skeptical. Evelyn guided them around the property, showing them the layers of hardened ground, the dead vegetation, the metallic shimmer of the sand under sunlight. She told them everything she knew, everything Thomas had kept in his notes for decades. The story grew. Photos spread online, side-by-side comparisons of Arcos's restoration and the grim reality. Public reaction was swift. Environmental groups demanded accountability. Politicians issued statements. The name Arcos, once associated with innovation, now appeared beside words like cover-up and contamination. Through it all, Thomas watched quietly. He seemed to grow smaller each day, his energy fading as the world around him finally caught up with the truth he had carried alone for so long. One afternoon, Evelyn found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the rain-soaked sand. "They'll make it right now," she said, hoping to comfort him. He smiled faintly. "They'll talk about making it right. That's a start." She sat beside him. You could leave, you know. Let them handle it from here." He shook his head. "I don't want to leave. This is the only place that knows what I did and what I tried to fix. It's home, even if it's broken." His words stayed with her long after he went inside to rest. She knew he wouldn't leave, and she wouldn't ask again. A week later, the results of the investigation were made public. The commission confirmed what Evelyn and Thomas had proven. The soil was irreversibly contaminated with heavy metals and chemical stabilizers. Construction of any kind was prohibited. The site was declared a zone of ecological risk, and Arcos was fined heavily for regulatory violations. Their executives resigned within days. The announcement made headlines across the state. For most people, it was just another story, an example of corporate greed and bureaucratic failure. But for Evelyn, it was something more tangible. It was proof that truth, even buried under layers of sand and silence, could still find its way to the surface. When she arrived at Thomas's house that evening, she found the door slightly open. The interior was dim, the air still. Thomas was sitting in his chair, his eyes closed, his hands resting on the armrests. The newspaper from that morning lay on his lap, folded neatly to the front page, where the article about Arcos's defeat was printed. He looked peaceful, as if he had simply decided to stop moving. Evelyn stood there for a long time, unable to speak, the rain whispering against the roof. She finally crossed the room and placed her hand on his shoulder. His skin was cool, but his expression calm, almost satisfied. Later, when the authorities came, she stayed outside on the porch, watching as the forest darkened. The sound of rain blended with the hum of distant thunder. She thought of what Thomas had said, that staying didn't mean winning, but maybe, she realized now, it meant something else. Bearing witness until the end. Months passed. Winter came early that year, blanketing the forest in snow. The sand, once glaringly pale, now lay hidden beneath a soft white sheet. Evelyn visited often, even after the property was officially designated as protected land. Volunteers had started to arrive, students, scientists, locals, planting trees along the outer edges of the contaminated zone. The work was slow, careful, but it was honest. She helped when she could, though she mostly spent her time documenting the process, taking photographs not for publicity, but for memory. Each image captured a fragment of healing, a young pine rising from the frost, water pooling in cracks that once repelled it, the faint green haze of moss daring to return. One afternoon in spring, she walked the perimeter of the site. The air smelled of thawing soil and new beginnings. Near the western edge, where the old drilling marker B14 had once stood, she saw something small breaking through the ground, a seedling, fragile and determined. She knelt beside it, brushing the damp sand away. It was a pine. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. The forest behind her whispered softly in the wind, and she could almost imagine Thomas sitting on the porch, nodding in quiet approval. She smiled, pulled out her camera, and took a single photo. Then she closed her notebook, knowing she would not need to write another word. When she left that day, the sun was low, spilling light across the trees. The once dead land glowed faintly, no longer a wound, but a scar that had learned to live with itself. Evelyn paused at the edge of the forest and looked back one last time. The house stood small in the distance, its stone walls catching the last light of evening. She whispered into the wind, a promise more than a farewell. "The world remembers," she said, "even when people don't." Then she turned toward the road, the scent of pine filling the air, and walked into the fading light, the sound of her footsteps mingling with the rustle of leaves, a quiet reminder that some truths, once uncovered, never disappear again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next videos to uncover new stories, and share this one so others can experience it too.